Hello there, and welcome to the second half of the deck review compilation. I will have a new deck review coming out very soon, but until then, you can munch on this. Just watch it repeatedly until the next one comes out. How about? That sounds great. You should definitely do that. Alright, let's jump into it. Hey folks, welcome back to another deck review. The first deck I'll be reviewing is Joey's Mono White Reaper King deck. This is, as the title suggests, a Reaper King deck that contains no cards outside of the white color identity, aside from the commander. Reaper King is a potent commander, stapling a Vindicate to every Scarecrow played after him, and Reaper King decks can manifest a couple different ways. One option is to make them a slower, more controlling deck, waiting for Reaper King to be out and then playing a number of Scarecrows afterward. The other option is to play Scarecrows right out of the gate, using Reaper King's Anthem effect to swing in for damage, and then follow up using Scarecrows to clear a path to victory. This deck seems to be splitting the difference a bit. There are tools such as Tempered Steel and Chief of the Foundry that seem oriented toward artifact beats, and there's also a healthy Flicker package and some heavy-duty ramp, which seems more inclined toward a later game Reaper King deck. The overall structure of the deck seems to be a cross of a Lochiel deck and a Reaper King deck, blending these different but not incompatible playstyles, with a core of colorless Scarecrows. Overall, this deck is cool. I enjoy creative deck restrictions, and the choice to fit a lot of artifact creature synergies into a Scarecrow deck is a fun one. This deck likewise has really fun inclusions. Oswald Fiddlebender is a cool tutoring piece, and Cybermen Squadron is a great amplifier for Reaper King, and the fact that less than 1% of Reaper King decks include either of these cards is honestly kind of shocking to me. So overall, I think this deck is working with some good ideas, and it has a lot of potential for unique gameplay. That said, this deck does strike me as a bit unfocused due to its mixture of earlier and later game focuses. The Artifact Creature Beats package includes some amount of stuff that's good across the board, like Lochiel and Rebek, but it also includes things that seem much more oriented toward an early game beatdown plan, like Dolmen Gate and Oltec Matter Weaver. Along with this, the deck includes stuff clearly oriented toward the later game, with the Flicker plan standing out as a major focus here. My opinion is that this deck would benefit from deciding where it wants to focus its attention and then committing to that. Both a later game plan that focuses more heavily on Reaper King triggers and an earlier game plan that focuses more on artifact beats are valid plans, and choosing one of these to focus on a bit more heavily will improve the deck. The Flicker package in particular deserves discussion here. The deck only has 4 ETB creatures outside of the commander, and since the commander is a high removal priority here, this makes the 7 Flicker cards in the deck a bit awkward. Cutting some of the weaker parts of this package or adding in more ETB would be the most concrete way to focus this deck a bit. The next deck I'll be reviewing is Philodemon's deck in the Court of the Crimson Dong. This is a Dong Zhao, the Tyrant deck, that is looking to use the commander's damaging ETB triggers in conjunction with other forms of damage to pressure down opponents. The deck has 8 cards that seem intended to increase the number of commander triggers, as well as a couple overall damage amplifiers. The deck also contains a fair amount of ramp and removal, as well as a suite of defensive cards intended to keep opponents at bay. Notably, 2 of these defensive cards discourage go-wide plans without discouraging swinging with larger singular creatures, and this is a neat counterbalance to the commander who punishes large creatures. The deck also has a couple cards that bolster opponents as well, putting it firmly in the territory of, what are the kids calling it these days, Aikido? The deck seems largely not too focused on creature combat, but it does have a handful of more combat-oriented creatures, namely a few fire breathers, as well as a handful of additional mana sinks. Overall, I like this deck. The aforementioned Dong is a pretty hilarious commander choice, bringing a healthy dose of Portal 3 Kingdoms energy to the table, and he's also not even a particularly bad card for the time. Causing an opponent's creature to hit them is a solid effect, and thankfully Red has access to ways of synergizing with the effect of an ETB creature, namely cards that create token copies. This deck has either 3 or 4 of those effects, depending on if you count Felden of the Third Path, and it also has some Flicker effects, as well as a Sanctum of Eternity for getting additional value out of Dong. The deck's defensive plan is likewise solid. There's a lot of removal in this deck, and it also contains the defensive cards I mentioned earlier as well. As with other Aikido-style decks, there could certainly be a question of what this deck's proactive plan is. Opponents can simply choose not to play a creature with a high enough power to take a large chunk out of their life total. As for that, this deck does have a handful of proactive threats, like a couple fire-breathing creatures and a couple slug effects, But this deck definitely seems quite reactive overall, making me think that ways of putting on pressure proactively could be worth thinking about if somebody was trying to improve this. The other question I have is how this deck plans to spend all of its mana, given that it has a lot of ramp and not a lot of draw. There are certainly a handful of mana sinks in the deck, but it might not be a bad idea to add a couple more, or a bit of draw to reduce the number of situations where the deck has mana but no place to put it. The next deck I'll be reviewing is Joey-Con1's deck, Flub the Flog. This is a Flubs the Fool Storm deck, and as with most Flubs decks, a good portion of it is devoted to negating the downsides of Flubs. Any normally structured deck playing Flubs will find Flubs to be quite the liability. The only way to have him draw you more cards than you discard in that sort of deck is to play cards one by one off the top of one's library, making efforts to never accumulate the dreaded 2 cards in hand. Even in a deck dedicated to maximum playability of each cards, passing the turn with a card in hand will result in 2 cards the following turn. A major way this deck gets around Flub's downsides is by casting things from places other than its hand, with Aruth being one of the strongest options for this. There are also a couple of artifact cards that redirect discarded cards to other places, which can help mitigate the downside of discarding to Flubs. This particular deck is also a storm deck of sorts, and as such, features a number of rituals, cost reducers, and cards that are good when a lot of spells are cast in one turn, including 3 cards that actually have storm. This is assisted by a handful of extra land play cards, which can allow it to keep going once it's beginning to storm off, rather than getting stuck with a land in hand and needing to pass the turn. This deck seems to be looking to ramp and set up cards to mitigate the downsides of Flubs in earlier stages of the game, before playing Flubs once it's low on cards and trying to cast as many spells as possible on each of its turns from there. Overall, the Storm game plan seems pretty solid here. The deck's land count of 34 is pretty low, and normally this would be in contradiction with the number of extra land play spells the deck is running, but Storm decks generally tend to run lower land counts to prevent losing momentum, and extra land play cards can more accurately be thought of as a Flub's downside mitigation tactic here. The deck is likewise relatively low on removal and counterspells, and that's also to be expected. This is a very proactive deck that is looking to steamroll ahead with its own game plan, and since every top deck matters, it makes sense to run as little stuff as possible that is situational, or that otherwise might get in the way of a long storm turn. This doesn't seem like a hard storm deck. Like, you're not going to have many double-digit spell count turns, as best I can tell. Correct me if I'm wrong, Joey-Con1. But minimizing dead draws is still useful, and it might even be worthwhile to trade out the counterspell for something more general, like Unsubstantiate or Decisive Denial. As far as the deck's plan to win goes, this deck definitely gets going pretty good at some point, but based on a bit of playtesting, it seems like the speed at which it can jump into a game plan depends a lot on whether it gets one of a few key cards. Aruth pairs quite well with Flubs, to the point where I wonder if it isn't worth adding in the Wizard Cycling cards or another tutor to try and grab her. I could also see some additional Future Sight style cards being a good choice for a Flubs Storm deck, since they'd likely improve consistency and be an additional buffer against stallouts. The final deck I'll be reviewing is Elijah's secret Orvar deck named Scion of the Not Dragon. This is a deck that is looking to tutor Orvar out with Scion of the Dragon before either generating a massive amount of value with Orvar or going infinite. This is done through a mixture of cost reducers and buyback cards. The cost reducers lower the cost of a buybacked card to a single colored mana, and the buyback cards then target a creature or another permanent, which makes a copy of it with Orvar. Depending on what's copied, this can mean going infinite. If a Mana Rock or a Peregrine Drake is copied, this can mean infinite mana, or infinite spellcasts if nothing else. There might be another way for things to go infinite here, but since this deck doesn't contain haste enablers that could allow immediate tapping of mana dorks, I'm not finding it. From there, the deck is looking to win through either a Storm card or Biovisionary. In order to build up its resources, the deck contains a lot of ramp, and it also has some different dragons that can be grabbed with its commander rather than Orvar. The deck also contains some reanimation spells that can be used to grab back the grabbed dragons. This is a pretty daring combo deck, and I respect the vision here. Orvar is a fun card, and giving him access to 4 additional colors really expands the number of options. As with the last deck, this deck is running a pretty small interaction count, and while this isn't totally unexpected for a fiercely proactive deck, in this case it might be wise to slot in some flexible options, like ones attached to ramp spells and ones attached to dragons. As far as the combo itself goes, I can see a cool vision here, though the deck does seem like it's in a somewhat intermediate phase between a full combo deck and more of an explosive but non-infinite Orvar deck. It certainly can go infinite, but the only copied creature that seems to generate colored mana is Peregrine Drake, and this is tricky considering that of the 7 targeted buyback spells, 5 target creatures and only 2 can target artifacts. Copying creatures is useful, since I imagine a common play pattern for the deck is copying one of its 3 non-legendary cost reducers, but without copying Mana Rocks or Peregrine Drake, I imagine this deck will be stuck to strong but undeniably finite turns that involve creating roughly as many copies of a creature as the deck has mana. This is a valid place for the deck to be. However, if the intention was more to go infinite, all it would take is adding some additional haste granters such as Temur Ascendancy and Urabrask the Hidden. Regardless, one final caution I would add is that this seems like the sort of deck that might not guarantee interesting play patterns long term. It's a blast to think about and build this sort of deck, but as I mentioned in my video about a month back, where I talked about goofy combo decks, there will often be decks where the fun value in practice doesn't live up to the cool expectations for it. Just something to think about when brewing funky combo decks. Hey folks, welcome back to another deck review. The first deck I'll be reviewing is Amy's Rain Academy Chancellor deck. This is a Voltron deck running a mixture of auras and equipments to buff up Rain and then presumably use her ability to draw cards once she or some scary buffing permanents inevitably attract removal. The first thing I note about this deck is that it is utterly packed to the rafters with protection. There are 4 Ward Granters, 4 Spell Redirectors, 3 Umbras, and 6 other pieces of protection, and then 5 counterspells to top all that off. There are also 20 cards that buff the damage of Rain, with 9 of those buffing that damage by at least 2, which makes sense as she is a 1/1. There are also 13 cards that grant Rain evasion, with 8 of these granting flying, 4 of these granting unblockable, and Octopus Umbra granting octopus arms for purposes of slapping blockers out of the way. Beyond this, the deck contains some ramp, some draw, and a handful of cards for purposes of defense. 3 of these deter attacks, and Shadow Spear can also help the deck stabilize its life total against opposing aggression. Overall, this seems like a pretty decent Voltron deck. Rain is certainly an interesting commander, as being a keywordless 3-mana 1/1 is far from the ideal beatdown stat line, but I love the old school energy, and her ability actually seems quite neat here. A Voltron deck is a great way to get opponents to target your stuff, since they'll be terrified about their life totals. Of the deck's 22 cards that provide protection of some sort, more than half are reactive, and these allow the deck to draw cards off Rain without even needing to lose her. Even if the deck doesn't have protection when opposing removal is cast, Rain gives 2 cards worth of opportunity to draw it, and even if that doesn't pan out, these cards can also help the deck not fall too far behind if it ends up getting 2 for 1 or 3 for 1 when Rain gets slapped down with a bunch of auras on her. So, I like the overall idea here, and this deck runs decent numbers of different supporting cards. A solid set of Mana Rocks, a nice draw suite that leans on the smaller side for draw spells, which makes sense with the card drawing commander, and a solid enough amount of evasion. Where I worry a bit more is in this deck's relationship with opposing game plans. There isn't much in the way of options for dealing with opposing boards, and only a little bit of defense. This could be okay in a Voltron deck, since player removal is an option, but with a 1/1 commander and mostly small-scale buffing options, I worry that this deck will lack the speed in some games to outrun opponents. Adding in a bit more in the way of defense, such as a Dissipation Field or some other options for bouncing opposing permanents, seems like it'd help to keep back opposing pressure until the deck is closer to finishing people off. The second deck I'll be reviewing is Ubban's High Power Necrobloom deck. This is a toolbox lands deck in Abzan colors that seeks to build value on a number of different fronts before ending the game with either a combo, beatdown, or overwhelming value in some form. Necrobloom is a very compact commander in that it has 2 different relevant abilities. The Dredge one gives a ton of utility in bringing back lands and getting cards in the yard, and the Landfall one can build up blockers or creatures to swing with. As a toolbox deck, the deck contains 8 land tutors as well as 3 creature tutors, and these give a wide range of options to grab. There's Interaction like Boseiju Who Endures, there's Glacial Chasm for defense, there's Field of the Dead for additional tokens, and plenty of other options that can help the deck weather various situations. The deck's creature base is likewise packed with utility, including draw engines, ramp creatures, land recursion, and more. In addition to its land-based interaction options, the deck has a number of non-land removal spells, making its base of options to slow down opponents pretty solid. Finally, the deck likely wins through either token beats or a combo. There are a number of different combos in here. Cultivator Colossus is basically a 1-card combo with the commander that can put the deck into a position that's hard to lose from. There are other combos that grant infinite mana, and one option for finishing out the game is playing and replaying a crime land an arbitrarily large number of times to ping opponents down. If you're interested in the details here, Ubban wrote a detailed primer for this deck that's attached to the deck list. This deck looks like a lot of fun. Lands in general are super cool to me, and this deck is no exception. Being able to fit an intense density of utility into a card type that most decks take for granted is pretty neat. In addition, I love the toolboxy nature of land tutors, and also the Necrobloom's ability to basically make the graveyard a second library that it can always tutor from. The inclusion of a couple rad counter cards is likewise fun. I actually hadn't seen Nuclear Fallout before, and it seems like quite a nice package between being a board wipe and being a graveyard enabler. The deck's synergies seem quite well interwoven, and there's a lot of interaction here, both in the lands and outside of the lands. I'm struggling to come up with any points to critique here. No card seems out of place, and they seem pretty well meshed. I think the counts of different types of cards also look solid, and overall, yeah, this deck looks like it is going to be doing cool things, and I would probably need to get down into the weeds with Necrobloom specifically in order to have a solid critique. The third deck I'll be reviewing is Onion Knight Vol's Kellen Daring Traveler deck. This is a lands deck that is built around using Kellen to draw into low-cost creatures, as well as putting lands into the graveyard. Of the deck's 34 creatures, 31 are 3 mana or less, which gives a solid chance of Kellen drawing something. The deck also includes 15 different cards that mill, as well as 12 cards that return cards from graveyard in some form, mostly lands. Within the deck's 41 lands, there are a number of different options: Dark Depths and Field of the Dead as finishers, along with a few ways to sacrifice Dark Depths. The deck also contains Talon Gates of Madara, Blast Zone, and some Graveyard Hate options as interaction within the land suite. The rest of the deck is mostly support cards, a bit of ramp, some tutors, some filtering, and a handful of utility creatures to round out the game plan. Broadly, I love this concept. Kellen is a commander I've had my eye on for a while, and the choice to run him in a deck with a land graveyard package is a cool one. One struggle of the card is that hitting a card that's not a cheap creature off of one of his triggers feels like a whiff in some sense, and having more than a 2/3 chance to whiff on a draw engine isn't great. However, if there's a 30% chance to draw a creature, paired with a 40% chance to drop a land into the yard, suddenly that's a much better rate if you can take advantage of it. I also like that this deck pairs small creature game plans with some conventional land-based win cons. That definitely grants a lot of flexibility in its play patterns. The main area of concern I have for this deck is that there's just not much in the way of removal. Only 2 cards that remove creatures with any degree of permanency, and not much for non-creature permanents either. As I mentioned in relation to the Voltron deck earlier, this isn't necessarily a critical flaw for a deck, but it does mean that a deck should have a relatively fast and efficient proactive game plan. The deck has a low mana curve and a decent number of ways to put together value engines, but I see it being more of a grindy deck than a wildly fast one. In addition, the commander is a 2/3 that needs to attack to gain value, and opponents having undisrupted boards could get in the way of that. Kellen dying could give an opportunity to recast Journey On, which could work as a grindy value play, but again, not wildly speedy. There are a lot of decent options for removal that could be Kellen grabbable. Brexage, Haywire Might, Skyclave Apparition, or even a stacks piece like Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. That's what I'd go into at least, something to slow down opponents a bit. Honestly, I might try my own riff on this idea, because this seems like a really fun concept. The final deck I'll be reviewing is Dr. Majalis' deck, Maelstrom Insanity. This is a Maelstrom Wanderer ramp deck that is looking to ramp hard into an early Maelstrom Wanderer play before beating down opponents with a mixture of threats. The deck has a truly ridiculous amount of ramp. 28 non-land pieces plus a few lands that can give an extra boost, and these are likely helpful for hitting a turn 5 or even turn 4 Maelstrom Wanderer. The deck's total land count is 39, plus 3 MDFCs, which seems likewise helpful for boosting up to Maelstrom Wanderer. Outside of these, the deck has a fair amount of removal, with much of this being attached to removal engine creatures like Drakuseth and Kogla. The deck also has a bit of draw, as well as some cards that seem intended to bounce Maelstrom Wanderer back to hand for some additional casts. Finally, the deck also has some number of cards that look to be here to push it to the finish line, such as Karlach and Pathbreaker Ibex. The biggest thing that stands out to me about this deck is that it is clearly prioritizing early Maelstrom Wanderer plays above most other play aspects of the deck. This isn't a choice without merits. Maelstrom Wanderer can have a potentially colossal impact on the state of the game the turn it hits the board, and being able to land it earlier has the potential to offer a really punishing rollout. In addition, the deck's choice to run a bunch of 6 to 7 drop creatures with removal attached means that the deck has the potential to seriously destabilize opponents early. However, the quantity of ramp here is a bit concerning for purposes of Maelstrom Wanderer's cascade hits. I definitely get the appeal here. It seems like part of the idea of the deck is that Maelstrom Wanderer will be cast multiple times, and that is facilitated by ramp spells. But I could still see it running out of gas occasionally, or alternatively just hitting too few big creatures to put on as much pressure as might be ideal. One way to avoid this while keeping up the current speed of rollouts could be to add some cards that can ramp but also provide other benefits, such as drawing cards or being a beater. I personally could also see going even harder into removal engines, but I'm a sucker for 6 to 7 cost removal engines, and their effectiveness may vary depending on the sorts of decks you find yourself playing against. Howdy folks, and welcome to my November deck review. The first deck I'll be discussing is Noah's Onyxia deck, Enchant Token Swarm. Onyxia is a 5-mana 4/4 that gives enchantment creatures Menace and exiles an enchantment from her controller's graveyard to recur as a 3/3 enchantment creature whenever she enters or attacks. This deck has an especially prominent focus on populate and other copy effects, which could allow the deck to be quite explosive, seeing as how 10 of these are themselves enchantments. Let's imagine Anointed Procession causing Onyxia to create 2 copies of an exiled token amplifier rather than 1. You can see how quickly things might get out of hand. To accompany this spooky token plan, the deck also features a number of cards here for purposes of getting stuff in the graveyard, of which 5 are enchantments. In addition to these, there's a decent ramp package as well as a handful of options each for drawing and tutoring. As a general game plan, this deck is likely looking to leverage Onyxia's ability to its maximum potential, creating and amplifying tokens to create an unstoppable swarm of 3/3 enchantment creatures. Overall, I see a lot of potential here. This deck features a truly impressive number of cards for amplifying tokens, and this will definitely lead to good results when the deck is able to get going. In addition, there are acceptable numbers of each type of supporting card, so I don't see there being any terrible deficits here. However, it seems like this list is likely giving up some degree of resiliency and seeking out explosiveness in its current form. In particular, there's just not a very impressive amount of draw present here. The best way to be resilient is to spread out stored resources between different zones and card types. In this deck's case, it's mostly spreading out resources between board and graveyard, and a mixture of enchantment creatures and non-creature enchantments in terms of permanence. This likely means an okay level of resiliency, since neither creature wipes nor graveyard hate will totally blow out the deck, but enchantment wipes will be pretty brutal, and a bigger focus on cards in hand could help mitigate this. Elemental Bond seems like a sweet inclusion, as does Tribute to the World Tree if the mana pans out, and I could see other enchantment-related draw sources being nice to have as well. These can lend a bit more stability to the game plan without sacrificing too much explosiveness. As a final note here, I'm not sure if they're being excluded for a reason, but the 2 wipes that destroy all non-enchantment creatures could be pretty sweet haymaker plays. I definitely get it if one-sided wipes aren't your speed though. The next deck I'll be reviewing is Harry's Lure deck, titled Fuck the System. This deck's command zone features Silas Wren, a 3-mana 2/2 Death Touch creature that can recur artifacts, alongside the rarely seen Sidar Kondo of Jamura, a 4-mana 2/5 with flanking that effectively grants flying to attacking creatures with power 2 or less. This is a lure deck, so naturally there are 8 lure effects, cards that require all available blockers to block a creature. To go along with these, there are also a number of cards that are here seemingly with the intent to have lures put on them. These include the 2 Glissas, a number of other Death Touch creatures, Gorilla Berserkers, and the terrifying Vicious Battle Rager, whose life total melting ability can pretty easily one-shot a player if they have more than 5 or so creatures. The deck also contains a handful of artifacts that can be looped with Silas Wren for card advantage, as well as a handful of cards that can help fill the deck's graveyard. Beyond these, the deck features 4 different Biden of Thassa effects, which can be used alongside a lure to allow some smaller creatures to chip in for damage, while a luring creature does their nefarious bidding. I could also see these being used alongside Sidar Kondo to get in for some evasive damage. Beyond these, a modest ramp suite and a healthy interaction suite round out the deck. This deck is working with some cool ideas. Lure is a fun card, and some of the cards this deck is pairing it with are undoubtedly cool as well. The pairing with Silas also works nicely, as he's a consistent Death Touch creature that can also enable some artifact-based utility. However, this deck's elements currently don't seem to be coming together that smoothly. Lure-based creature wipes are inherently the sort of thing that will be very strong against decks with a handful of large creatures, but weaker against a lot of other types of deck, so spending too much deck space on them will naturally leave a deck without the resources needed to deal with decks that are less dependent on key creatures. This deck also has several small Death Touch creatures and other cards seemingly intended as lure targets, but a lot of these aren't even all that great at that, and the profile of small Death Touch creatures is already covered by Silas. Replacing a portion of the lure support with more baubles for Silas, as well as some Blood Artists or something similar to apply life total pressure, could help make the deck more consistent across matchups, and also improve filtering overall. Also, I don't like to suggest command zone changes in these, but Harry mentioned that this deck was feeling a bit disjointed, so I feel like I should bring it up. Sidar feels a bit out of place here. He has anti-synergy with a number of lure targets, since you can't force your opponents to block an evasive creature, and though he has other utility in the deck, this point of conflict still seems likely to come up. My best guess is that he's here for the colors, and there are a handful of sweet white cards here, like Abu Jafar and Indrik Umbra, but it's not a massive number, and this extra color has the added downside of forcing this somewhat budget deck into needing a 4-color mana base, which is a bit rough. I'm not going to make a definitive statement on what should happen here, but I could see it being fun to try out Anara rather than Sidar. Her indestructible granting could bring out the strengths of Silas, particularly with a couple extra incidental buffs added, and she's a decent beater herself. Just an idea to ponder. Next up, let's talk about Willow's deck, Player of Games. This is a deck based around a Doctor Who Secret Lair commander, the Celestial Toymaker. He is a 3-mana 2/4 in Esper colors with an attack ability that is a fact or fiction style draw effect, and an additional effect on each end step that makes each opponent lose 2 life for each guess or group effect that occurred during that turn. This is an odd design that has implications on the way the deck plays, but I'll get to that in a bit. To start with, this deck has 22 guess or group effects to go with the Celestial Toymaker, of which 13 trigger once and the other 9 can trigger each turn. To go along with these, the deck also contains a number of cards that can amplify the Toymaker's triggers, either by copying the triggers or by copying the Toymaker himself. There are 4 of the former and 11 of the latter, and of those 11 copy effects, 3 don't negate the legend rule, making them only useful for copying one of the 7 other copy effects that do negate the legend rule, which isn't a terribly low number, I just felt like pointing it out. The last one is original Sakashima, by the way. Outside of these cards to help enable the commander, the deck is also running a lot of protection. 8 cards here especially for protection, and 7 counterspells. This deck's overall game plan seems to be to try and maximize Celestial Toymaker's end-of-turn triggers to drain down opponents, while maintaining a consistent flow of card advantage through a variety of fact or fiction-esque draw effects. Overall, this is an interesting deck, and it's doing a lot right for purposes of maximizing the power of its odd commander. Copying the commander is quite an effective way to maximize his triggers, since you get both the attack ability and the end step ability doubled, meaning that life loss for opponents can theoretically go up quadratically with each additional Celestial Toymaker, going from 2 to 8 to 18 if all copies get to attack and survive to the end step. This is obviously quite alarming for opponents, so running a bunch of protection effects is good for making sure that the life loss drain can continue. This deck also gets to run a lot of really fun cards. Group and guest cards are very much in the spirit of Commander in my mind, since they consistently give agency to opponents, and this deck gets to run a lot of them that quite rarely see play. Most of these also draw cards, which allows the deck to find its pivotal copy effects, hopefully reliably. So I think this likely works as a cool deck at a decent power level to take advantage of unusual effects, and my power level tweaks would probably mostly consist of removing a handful of less useful cards for ones that might help the deck to stay alive amidst concerned opponents. Beyond that though, the longer I think about this deck, the weirder it seems. The fact that the deck runs so many grouping and guessing effects, even kinda bad ones, means that there will likely be a good degree of power level discrepancy moment to moment and game to game. The pile draw ones that allow opponents to make the final choice are especially awkward given that this deck has a key card type, creature copiers, that it's especially eager to get additional copies of. There's also the vibes issue of this deck encouraging running a whole bunch of group effects, mostly for the life loss that the commander promotes, relegating cool cards to basically being a means to an end. I don't know, I don't have any wildly damning critiques here. This deck just touches on a lot of interesting questions in EDH deck building. Finally, let's talk about another Doctor Who related deck, Wilkerson's Beatdown deck, titled Timey Whammy. This is a deck with the 10th Doctor and Tegan Jovanka in the command zone, and seems to have the goal of getting as many 10th Doctor activations as possible to gradually develop an overwhelming board of creatures. The creature base of this deck is relatively high curved and overwhelmingly combat oriented, with 13 different creatures that seem intended to push additional damage, as well as a number of non-creature cards. In addition to its 3 extra combat spells, the deck contains 5 additional cards that seem here with the intention of amplifying the 10th Doctor's on-attack triggers. Outside of these, the deck contains a solid ramp suite, modest suites for protection and draw, and a solid number of interaction spells of different types, though with most focused on removing or disabling creatures. For starters, this deck looks like a lot of fun. The pairing of the gradual engine that is the 10th Doctor with a highly aggressive creature suite is a cool idea, and likely results in some, for lack of a better word, inertia-oriented gameplay. The fact that extra combat spells both push damage and give additional 10th Doctor triggers is great, and I'd grab more of these if you can, honestly, though I know they tend to be a little pricey. One initial thought I had with this deck is that it might struggle against board wipes, but I think the commander actually provides a bit of a buffer against falling too far behind as a result of a board wipe, since after a handful of successful turns, the deck should have cards suspended that can help rebuild in the following turns. A bit more draw might be nice to help even further with not falling behind to a board wipe, but I don't think it's necessary to put in too much effort beyond that into mitigating the issue. What I would do, though, is add more lands. A land count of 33 with a curve this high just isn't going to be reliable. The deck's 6 or higher cost cards will end up stuck in hand some games, and I could see paying commander tax on the 10th Doctor getting pretty challenging at times, which will then have knock-on effects when cards intended to synergize with him can't reach their full potential. I think it would be appropriate to run at least 37 in a deck like this, and I personally would run more like 38 or 39 after counting MDFCs. These can be utility lands, though. You could add haste enablers like Slayer's Stronghold, or Handwear Battlements. You could add the red and white hideaway lands. And you could add card advantage lands like Monumental Henge and Transalore Clock Tower. There are plenty of good options out there. Hey folks, my voice is feeling mostly better now, and I plan to upload weekly for the next month, starting on the 7th. For now, though, I've got the December deck review. The first deck I'll be reviewing is Archedarp's deck, Kellum Plays Yu-Gi-Oh! This is a Kellen the Kid deck, and naturally it includes lots of cards that allow for the casting of cards from outside one's hand. And I do mean a lot. Almost half of the deck allows for casting cards from exile or some other zone. This deck also features 2 additional Kellens in the 99, which is a fun touch. Both of these are adventure cards, so they fit in just fine here. The deck features healthy, well-integrated suites of ramp and interaction, with a good portion of the cards in both of these categories able to trigger Kellen as well. Kellen serves as an effective way to pump up the volume of gameplay that the deck is able to undertake, allowing it to play cards faster than it might have otherwise, and as a result the deck seems like a pretty well-rounded snowball midrange deck. Overall, I like what's going on here. The card choices here are well picked to allow this deck to be cohesive, and there's lots of nicely overlapping roles here. The sheer numbers of different ways to cast things from outside of one's hand, plotting, foretelling, suspending, adventuring, cascading, rebounding, it's a great selection. Card choice-wise, I really only have one problem here, and that's that Lucky Clover and Gory and Wise Mentor really don't seem likely to pull their weight. Both of these duplicate adventure spells that get cast, which isn't bad in theory, but in practice this deck only has 11 adventure cards, and of those, only 8 or 9 are actually desirable to cast. Realistically, you need to cast at least 2 to get an acceptable amount of value off of either of these, and I don't see that happening reliably. Raynar is a somewhat similar deal for the Foretell mechanic, but at least for him there's a wider array of cards that generate 1/1 spirits, so there's a bit of extra utility there. The only other change I'd suggest for this deck is adding a bit more draw. It has an okay amount currently, but the commander is quite good at rapidly playing out cards from a player's hand, and I have to imagine that a bit more draw wouldn't hurt for maintaining cards in hand. Next up, I want to talk about Lettuce's Falco Spara deck. This is a Voltron adjacent counters deck, using the commander as both a flampling beater and a source of draw. The deck features a number of cards that can put +1/+1 counters on creatures, as well as a number of other cards that can amplify counters. There are also a handful of cards with counters the deck might actively want to remove, such as Devoted Druid and Glenalandra Archmage, which put -1/-1 counters on themselves. These sorts of cards constitute fantastic value engines with Falco Spara. Aside from +1/+1 counters, this deck also features a handful of other ways to pump up the commander, though these are clearly secondary to the +1/+1 counters plan. Other parts of the deck consist of a healthy number of cards for protecting the commander, a pretty diverse interaction suite, and a variety of different ramp cards. This deck seems like it'll be looking to pile up counters on its commander, swinging in and keeping the rest of the table in check through a variety of different interaction tools until it can finish them off through commander damage. I like this creative riff on Falco Spara. The Flying Trample body is undoubtedly a solid one for a Voltron deck, and a +1/+1 counter focus likewise seems like a solid choice. I can see a bunch of great individual packages with the commander, and combinations of cards that could bring great results if drawn together. However, this deck also strikes me as a bit unfocused. I can see the idea of a creature-light Voltron deck with cards such as Slash the Ranks, Divine Reckoning, and Final Showdown, but the deck ends up with a not insubstantial creature count of 20 for the simple reason that there are lots of creatures that work well with Falco Spara. The deck also features a fair number of cards that amplify counters put on cards, but this deck doesn't actually have that many counter-gaining cards in the first place. Hardened Scales in particular stands out as a card that is not going to be feeling all that useful in a lot of games. Some of the challenges here are kind of inherent to the deck concept. Most of the strong counter synergies out there are intended for creature-heavy decks that focus on a synergistic snowballing playstyle, and that's just not something that's going to mesh super cleanly with a Voltron playstyle. However, I think a bit of tuning could help this deck feel at least a bit more cohesive. There are ramp options like Kami of Whispered Hopes and Biophagus that could play into the counters theme, and equipments like Pip-Boy 3000 and Lost Jitty that could do the same. Silkguard and Innkeeper's Talent are another couple cards that can help with protection while also just being quite solid cards all around. With a greater density of cards that grant and play off of counters, I imagine the deck could feel better rounded and play more smoothly. The next deck I'll be discussing is Unidentified Flying Objections Flame War deck. Flame War is a Transformers commander where one side is a Menace Death Touch 2/1 that exiles cards with it equal to dealt damage and flips whenever it hits a player, and the other side allows its controller to pay 1 and discard their hand, to put the exiled cards into hand. It's kind of like a cross between Sergeant John Benton and a Bomat Courier, which is cool because I like both of those designs. A core pillar of this deck is Pump Spells. The deck contains 33 cards that buff a creature's power in some way, with 26 of those buffing it by at least 2. 11 of these pump spells also grant Trample, which pairs nicely with the Death Touch Menace pairing on the vehicle form of Flame War, and the deck also contains 7 cards that grant Haste and 6 cards that grant First Strike. Since it's a Voltron deck, this deck also naturally contains a healthy suite of protection cards, which are split between different card types and different forms of protection. Finally, the deck also contains modest suites of removal and ramp, as well as a handful of artifacts for purposes of converting Flame War to its backside. The game plan of this deck seems simple. Pump up Motorcycle Flame War to get a healthy pool of cards in exile, then restock your hand using Robot Flame War's discard ability, rinsing and repeating from there. I love this deck's plan. The commander is similar-ish to Xyrus and Sergeant John Benton in the way it operates, but the differences in color identity and mechanism really bring a lot of charm to this deck. The deck is quite low-curved, and paired with a likewise low-costed commander, I have to imagine this grants a nice degree of speed, flexibility, and resilience. Among its pump spells, this deck has a healthy mixture of Trample, First Strike, Haste, Indestructible, and other things that likely keep it well-rounded, and the somewhat small quantity of removal this deck contains seems fine, given that this is a high-velocity Voltron deck. I'm also impressed by the number of artifacts this deck manages to pack into it. Lack of sack fodder might be a concern for this commander, but this deck seems to have plenty of artifacts that should be available for sacrificing. So overall, I'm loving this deck. The sole question mark I have with this deck is with the discard synergies. I see Glinthorn Buccaneer and Bralin Skyshark Raider, and I have to wonder how often they're feeling truly great. I feel like this deck's biggest weakness should be its commander getting stonewalled by removal, or opponents developing too hefty abortive blockers, and while these could help in the latter scenario if a different opponent is attackable, I still have to wonder if some extra removal, evasion, or protection wouldn't be a better usage of these slots. The fourth deck I'll be discussing is Dom's deck, Ballin. This is a Ball Lord of Murder Aristocrats deck that focuses on gaining value through sacrificing creatures. There are 18 cards in this deck that sacrifice themselves or other cards, and half of these can sacrifice at least one creature per turn. To go along with these, there are a number of payoff cards that do things when creatures die. There's the Commander that gives creatures +1/+1 counters and goads them, but there are also 6 cards that draw cards when friendly creatures are sacrificed, as well as 3 others with other effects attached. The third piece of this is recursion. There are a handful of creatures like Squee that seem specifically intended to be sacrificed multiple times, and there are also a wide variety of different recursion effects for returning creatures from the graveyard. These 3 elements combine to form a formidable Aristocrats-esque engine that can effectively generate value, and Ball is here to make sure that opposing creatures stay away until the deck has taken over the game. A hefty quantity of removal, a medium-sized ramp suite, and a small leaving graveyard package round out this deck. Overall, I love the cohesion of this deck. The card choices strike me as highly intentional. Synergies are tight and layered, with lots of cards serving multiple roles for the deck. The draw, ramp, and removal choices seem carefully tailored to the way this deck wants to play, and the resulting synergy density likely results in a wide on-ramp for the deck's game plans. I can even tell this deck's relationship with combos just by looking at it. It runs Persist creatures alongside Grumgully and Rhythm of the Wild, cards that could theoretically form an infinite combo, except that this deck lacks the full sack outlets that would allow it to actually go infinite with the combo. Heavy value looping is on the table, but not full infinite combos, which makes sense to me and is a healthy place to be at with a grindy mid-power deck. Really, I have exactly one issue with this deck, and that's that the mana base doesn't have enough green symbols in it. If I include the 29 lands, 7 MDFCs, and 1 Arcane Signet, this deck's symbols come out to 18 green symbols, 16 black symbols, and 16 red symbols. The black and red symbol counts might be okay given the deck has a handful of color-fixing dorks, but I definitely want more green symbols for this deck to be able to play those dorks, with 21 being a nice number to shoot for, in my opinion. One way to get closer to this could be to sub out a couple swamps and mountains for green-producing dual lands. It also might not be a bad idea to increase the land count overall with a couple color-fixing duals. This is an average curved deck with powerful yet fussy to put together value engines, and it's also running a bunch of MDFCs that may be worth casting from time to time. As a result, my best guess is that a couple extra lands could feel nice. The final deck I'll be reviewing is Paul's deck, 7-drop Tribal. This is a Maelstrom Wanderer deck with two main types of non-land card, ramp spells and bombs. Basically, it's trying to get a lot of mana and then play expensive cards, with the commander serving as a consistent bomb and a way to push the deck's aggression. The ramp spells present here have a variety of different mana costs. Of the 24, 3 cost 1 mana, 7 cost 2 mana, 9 cost 3 mana, and 5 cost 4 or more mana. Among the bombs, there is likewise a decent bit of diversity. There are a handful that draw cards, a handful that push the deck's mana even further, a handful that remove things, and some that amplify damage or give extra combats. It's easy to imagine some lucky cascade hits giving the tools to outright kill one or more players off of a turn 5 or so Maelstrom Wanderer. Aside from ramp and bombs, this deck also has a decent amount of draw, as well as a modest count of lower costed instant speed removal spells. This seems like a decently effective deck overall, though one thing I note about it is that it seems likely a bit inconsistent. This is mainly due to the cards involved. There's a good bit of variety in the cards in the deck. As I mentioned, the ramp suite has a spread out cost profile, whereas a lot of big mana decks will push toward a particular stair-stepping pattern with their deck, such as 1-3-5 or 2-4-7, that's in terms of mana curve to be clear. This deck's spread of mana costs among its ramp spells means that it will be taking a variety of different routes up to its higher costed cards. The ramp suite here also leans higher costed, which means less consistent rollouts, but also less variation in Maelstrom Wanderer hits. You're not going to hit a mediocre single ramping card as often. This isn't inherently a good or bad thing, though I personally would swap out some of the higher costed ramp for a couple reliable lower costed ones to let the deck start ramping early more consistently. Also, this deck seems to be somewhat focused on the long game rather than a fast rollout, but it also seems to have less of a focus on land ramp than I would expect. Replacing some dorks with land-based ramp could give better resilience against board wipes. Beyond that, I think this deck's card choices are pretty reasonable. It has a lot of variety among its 7-drops, with damage amplifiers and token creators and mana amplifiers and so on, and while this means a greater degree of swinginess and unpredictability in what play patterns the deck takes, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. This is a Maelstrom Wanderer deck. Explosive surprises is the name of the game, and that variety of bombs can lead to a fun and dynamic game. Hey folks. First, we've got Maddie's deck, Magario Party. This is a Magar of the Magic Strings deck based around discarding and then creating copies of large spells. Magar is an odd commander who can basically animate instants and sorceries in a player's graveyard as 3/3 creatures that cast copies of the spells when they deal combat damage to a player, which can get pretty dramatic with some of the bigger spell options. This deck has 10 instants and sorceries that cost 5 or more mana, with these containing a lot of classic Rakdos high drops such as Breach the Multiverse and Rise of the Dark Realms, as well as some more unusual cards like Bituminous Blast and Wake the Dragon. To support this, the deck has a suite of 17 cards that can help get cards into the graveyard, mostly through discarding, but also with a handful of options for tutoring and surveilling. Once some desirable spells are in play as 3/3 creatures, the deck has a handful of options to assist in getting maximum utility out of these spell creatures. This includes some cards to give the 3/3s evasion, and a handful of haste enablers, as well as some cards to grant double strike and copy large spells. It seems like this deck looks to win through overwhelming opponents with copies of large spells. Overall, I like what this deck is doing a lot. The core theme is well supported, with a number of different ways to get cards into the graveyard, and also a decent handful of options for making sure the 3/3s are able to get in 4 damage. There are also a number of clever overlapping roles here. Chainer reanimates discards and gives Megar's creatures haste. Urabrask grants haste and also makes attackers more likely to connect. Key to the City grants evasion as well as a way to get cards into the yard, and so on. The deck has plenty of lands, and this curve seems well coordinated to play a ramp spell on 2 into a 4-drop on turn 3 in a lot of games. I only really have one issue with this deck, and that's that the commander seems a bit too pivotal to the game plan, and the deck doesn't currently have any way to protect him. This doesn't seem like a fatal flaw in the deck's current form, given that the commander is relatively low cost, but it's still likely an obstacle in some games. To remedy this, it might be a good idea to add either protection or some additional ramp. Protection could look like Lightning Greaves or the recently printed Untimely Malfunction, and this could allow Magar to potentially stick around longer and not need to be cast and immediately activated every time. Alternatively, additional ramp could let the deck achieve immediate Magar activations more often, as well as playing higher costed spells for their base cost in games that Magar isn't panning out. Next up, let's talk about Detrov's deck. Yes, Queen. This is a Yasova Dragonclaw deck with a focus on stealing creatures and doing things with them, typically sacrificing them to a Birthing Pod style effect. The stealing package consists of the commander plus 3 additional cards, and the doing things with creatures package consists of 7 cards that can sacrifice things once per turn or more, 7 cards that are along the lines of a one-time sacrifice effect, and 4 cards that are either flicker effects or fight effects. With its focus on Birthing Pod effects, this deck naturally has a smooth curve of creatures tapering off at 7 mana, and there is a nice balance of different effects among creatures at each mana cost. In addition to the payoffs, the deck also contains a handful of cards to bolster the commander's power to allow her to steal a wider range of creatures, which includes a modest +1/+1 counter package with a handful of cards that grant 1 or 2 +1/+1 counters per turn. Outside of these elements, the deck has a modest ramp package that mostly features lower costed mana dorks, along with a relatively beefy draw suite and a diverse interaction suite. So broadly, I love the idea of this deck. Yasova is a pretty entertaining commander, and using her alongside Birthing Pod effects is a very amusing choice indeed. I also mostly like the card choices present here, and this deck has a nice interaction suite. That said, the balance of different elements feels a bit off the mark from what would allow the deck to perform the most smoothly. I think the deck leans a bit heavy in payoff at the moment. I don't know the exact right number of cards to sacrifice things that have been stolen, but the number right now is relatively high, and I could see these kind of piling up in hand without enough stuff to sacrifice. Speaking of which, let's get to the enablers of this deck. In principle, there's enough here. Like, a few extra creature stealing effects, plus some power buffers is adequate in the abstract, but I have some concerns about the details here. For one, a lot of the buffing cards are these kind of incremental cards that put counters on things 1 or 2 per turn, and I'm just not confident Yasova can be relied upon to stick around and play long enough to accumulate the necessary counters to steal larger creatures. Ornery Tumblewag and Court of Garenbrig in particular feel like solid cards for a dedicated counters deck, but relatively mediocre options for powering up Yasova. It might be worthwhile to try a smaller number of power enhancers that can each give more stats up front. Something like a Blackblade Reforged style equipment that just grants a bunch of power and toughness. Secondly, I'm not confident this deck has enough ramp to support the mana requirements of putting together what it wants to do. This is a draw-heavy deck with a lot of different mana-hungry elements that want to come together to produce a game plan, and the current ramp suite is both smaller and more dork-oriented than would likely be ideal to consistently achieve the sorts of gameplay it's looking for. Replacing some other stuff with land ramp would likely help smooth things out a good bit for this deck, and also allow it to be less vulnerable to board wipes. Next up, let's talk about Atog's deck, Embrace Your Inner Timmy. This is a Saheeli the Gifted artifact ramp deck. There's a lot of powerful stuff in here, but as best I can tell, the only actual factual combo here is Mycosynth Lattice plus some artifact sweepers, and with the deck's moderate number of tutors, we can call that the sometimes plan. The more common plan will be to ramp into Saheeli, get like 4 or so artifacts, and then use Saheeli to ramp into some stupid big spells on turn 4 or so. Said stupid big spells consist of big creatures such as Jin-Gitaxias and some Eldrazi, and there are also a number of extra turn spells, a big enough number where chaining extra turns feels like a reasonably likely way of trying to push the deck over the finish line. Outside of this deck's plan for winning, it has basically CEDH card quality. Fast mana for getting Saheeli out faster, powerful draw engines, the aforementioned tutors, and a high quality mana base with a handful of artifact lands. Interaction-wise, this deck is packing 7 counterspells and 8 cards for purposes of removing things, with the counterspells being generally quite low cost and the removal spells generally being quite high cost. This deck's game plan seems broadly competent and certainly fun in some sense. There's something appealing about playing some nasty 10-mana pieces of cardboard as fast as possible in a game, and this deck seems more than prepared to do that. The ratios of lands, ramp, draw, and tutors seem nicely chosen to let this deck play smoothly, and the card quality here is more than high enough to get things done. Where I'm a bit more curious is with the interaction base of this deck. As I mentioned, the removal suite of this deck is somewhat thin and relatively high cost on average, but honestly I don't mind this too much. This is a very proactive deck. It is looking to make big plays by turn 5 or so, and I don't think it'll be particularly a problem that this deck doesn't have efficient removal for specific types of card. Just take some extra turns, you'll probably figure something out. Where this deck feels a bit weaker is in its counterspells. This is a deck with some key vulnerabilities, such as its artifact getting destroyed and its commander getting hated out before it can use her. Packing a couple extra counterspells could likely help in avoiding hate, as well as nailing specific opposing spells in order to slow them down and buy the deck time to overwhelm them. Next, let's talk about Rold's Mindskinner mill deck. The Mindskinner was an intriguing mill commander that got released in Duskmourn, and it's one that mills each opponent as a replacement effect in place of damage you deal to any of them. Now, I should lay my cards on the table right now and say that I'm not the biggest fan of mill in EDH, particularly mono blue mill. In my experience, it tends to be basically a combo deck if built in an efficient way, and kind of a janky do-nothing deck if it's built less efficiently, a lot of times just bolstering graveyard decks without doing much else to participate in a game. That said, I'm still always interested to see design choices that make it more interesting in the context of EDH, and the Mindskinner does accomplish that in some interesting ways. One problem with mill is that since it involves a different win condition than damage, it's almost like an entirely separate game is happening. The Mindskinner doesn't fully solve this in the context of a multiplayer format, since you're still operating with a different objective than your opponent's, but it at least makes it so that your damage-dealing cards contribute to your objective, rather than being a pointless sideshow, and this also vastly widens the pool of cards that a mill strategy can utilize. Okay, with that long-winded tangent out of the way, what's going on with Rold's deck? Well, going along with what I said about the wider card pool, this deck contains 5 equipments for purposes of buffing the Mindskinner's power, as well as 4 creatures intended to let the deck have additional damage output. Bonehorde is a real standout here, and it's easy to imagine it vaporizing opposing libraries quite quickly. If opposing decks are, say, 30% creatures, the Mindskinner player can expect to clean out opposing libraries in roughly 3 swings of a Bonehording Mindskinner. Outside of the power-based stuff, the deck also contains 11 other mill and mill-adjacent cards, along with a few graveyard hate cards to try and ensure that opponents aren't able to take advantage of their graveyards getting filled up. There's also an average-sized draw suite and a robust ramp suite, as well as a good amount of interaction, both in terms of protection and in terms of dealing with opposing game plans and aggression. Mill decks do tend to draw aggression, so it's good to see this deck having a handful of solid options for staving that off. Overall, this game plan looks solid. I love the equipments for buffing up the Mindskinner, and a handful of protection cards available will hopefully help in preventing Mindskinner from getting killed too often. Having played against a Mindskinner deck before, probably a bit worse than this one, granted, it's always odd trying to decide where to put removal. And it always seemed like the Mindskinner player would eat a lot of attacks, but a somewhat smaller number of removal spells. I could imagine that easily changing with a big equipment like a Bonehorde or an Excalibur in play, though. This deck does have a pretty robust amount of ramp for a mono blue deck, and though I'm a bit curious with what it's looking to cast off of something like a Gilded Lotus, I could see there being things like equipping and recasting the commander that start eating up that amount of mana. What I'm a bit less sold on is some of the weaker mill cards. Codex Shredder's 1 card per turn mill capacity seems almost comedic compared to the commander's 30 card per turn baseline mill capacity, and other cards like Hedron Crab and Patient Rebuilding seem similarly a bit lackluster, even if a bit better than Codex Shredder. At a minimum, I'd probably want to trade out some of these for a bit more dedicated draw and filtering, and I could even see it being interesting to try out some more damage and protection in place of some of the other mill enchantments. That may just be my personal preferences speaking, though. The final deck I'll be reviewing is Scrotum Killer 69's Ball deck, Varunian War Profiteering. This one is decidedly a funky riff on Ball. There are all sorts of odd and intriguing choices that I can't help but appreciate, such as Hot Pursuit, Delirium, Shirei, and Seedling Charm. Broadly, the deck has a similar Aristocrats game plan to most Ball decks. There are a number of cards that recur creatures, or creatures that can recur themselves, and there are also a number of sacrifice outlets for repeating their deaths to guarantee Ball triggers. This deck is interesting in that it chooses to go for a narrower range of creature dying payoffs. There are a couple draw effects alongside Vicious Shadows, which is basically a turbocharged Blood Artist effect, as well as Gutter Grime, which can also serve to close out games through an overwhelming mask of size-increasing tokens. That's it though. Other than those four, it's Ball all day. Something that stands out about this deck is that it has an impressive number of low-cost creatures with ramp attached. There are 7 different cards in this category, and I could easily imagine these turning into an impressive ramp engine alongside Shirei or Marin. Outside of this core game plan, the deck also has an impressive amount of single-target removal, as well as a handful of protection spells for keeping Ball around. A couple theft effects round out this deck's ways of winning the game. Overall, this deck is funky, and it strikes me as a more streamlined presentation of the Ball game plan than most. A large emphasis is placed on keeping opponents in check, with the aforementioned large suite of single-target removal existing alongside Ball's Goad, and though the deck does have a decent draw suite, much of the draw is likewise one-time use in nature. This deck does have some win cons, but they feel more discreet compared to a lot of decks. Like you can one-shot somebody with a Fallen Idealed creature, or you can play Vicious Shadows and sacrifice a bunch of creature to clean the clocks of a couple players, or you can play a mob rule to get a nice swing with opposing creatures, or you can do any number of these things before finishing off the final player when a Hot Pursuit pops. However, the deck doesn't contain Blood Artist effects, or many creatures that seem like good candidates to attack in, and the amount of damage goaded creatures will dish out probably varies game to game. Ultimately, I personally would want to see a somewhat wider suite of options for closing things out, but I could see what's here working out in a lot of games. What I'm a bit less certain of is the amount of instants and sorceries, one-time use cards that accomplish a task and then are over and done with. Running some draw that ties in more closely with the Aristocrats theme seems like it would play more nicely than things like Dire Sight and Read the Bones, and I likewise wouldn't mind seeing a broader range of removal options. This deck has a heavy emphasis on single-target removal, mostly instants and sorceries, and I guess maybe that could come down to matchup considerations on some level. This is definitely the sort of removal suite I'd want for dealing with combo decks and other explosive strategies that demand mana-efficient, immediate answers. But they also aren't great in terms of value. I do worry that if you're playing a slower, more controlling deck with a whole lot of these, you risk falling behind when a large percentage of your draws don't tie into your central engine and just deal with a single threat. If this does sound like what's happening in some of your games, you could try exchanging some of these for removal that's attached to a creature and thus ties in better with the central game plan, or that targets multiple things and is better in terms of value as a result. Hey folks, welcome back to another deck review. The first deck I'll be discussing is OSRS Neobrand's deck, Join the Human Army. This is an Abzan Humans deck with a command zone made up of Ravos Soul Tender and Kamal, Heart of Krosa. This double Anthem command zone is a bold choice, and I respect it for a go-wide typal deck like Humans. Partnered command zones have a tendency to occasionally feel a bit arbitrary, but the fact that these are both humans and both make creatures larger make them feel like pretty cohesive choices. Within the deck, there are 43 creatures, with all but 2 of them being humans. The deck also contains a moderate number of human token producers, which makes sense with the commanders, as well as the anthems in the deck. There are a good number of cards that provide advantages to humans, whether that be anthem effects, or protection effects, or other types of effect. From there's a decent spread of different subthemes and synergies, with the creature base leaning closer to varied and interesting than necessarily the most strictly powerful choices. Rounding out the deck is a beefy interaction suite that features a nice blend of different types of removal. Overall, this deck looks pretty fun. I like the idea of a low-curved deck with a top-end partner pairing, and there's a lot of variety in what the lower-costed cards do outside of the fact that they're all humans. There are some conventional picks, like Adeline and Catilda, but also some funkier choices, such as Magus of the Library, Free Strider Lookout, and Wild Beastmaster. That last card really packs a wallop when paired with Anthem effects, especially Kamal, effectively doubling the power and toughness enhancement. As I mentioned earlier, this deck is also running a very nice suite of interaction, with single target removal for various types, Graveyard Hate, a couple board wipes, and a bit of stacks, all represented. One thing I'm not convinced by is the number of Anthem effects in the deck. Both commanders pump up this deck's board, and while I can see the appeal of running some tasteful number of additional anthems in a go-wide deck to pump up the damage, I can't say I'm really sold on the higher costed ones here. I'm likewise not sold on some of the worse recursion spells here, such as Phyrexian Missionary, since Ravos also helps out with that. Switching these cards out for some more draw or token production seems like it might lead to a smoother play pattern for this deck. Next up, let's talk about Quel'Th's deck, Bartolomé del Dream Den. This is a somewhat budget Bartolomé del Presidio Aristocrats deck, with Luris of the Dream Den as a partner. Naturally, this deck is exceptionally low curved, with all of its permanents being 2 or less mana and containing just a handful of higher costed instants and sorceries. Being an Aristocrats deck, this deck is chiefly interested in the sacrificing of permanents, along with the various payoffs this action can fuel. As with most Aristocrat decks, there are 3 key elements here. The first is the sacrificing itself, consisting of the sack outlet commander, 7 one-off sack effects, and 4 longer-term sack effects. The second element is the sack fodder, consisting of creatures that are convenient to sacrifice, as well as sources of recursion like Luris to ensure that a supply of cheap creatures remains available. The third element here is the payoffs, consisting mostly of blood artifacts that drain opponents when permanents are put into the graveyard. There are also elements that enhance the power of the effects generated by the deck's sack outlets, and these could also be considered a form of payoff. A major example here is evasion cards, which allow Bartolomé to get in for commander damage, utilizing the counters he gained from sacrificing things. Putting it all together, this deck is looking to get a sacrifice-based engine going, using Luris as a source of grindy value, and gradually defeating opponents with a variety of methods. Overall, this deck seems decently well put together. There's roughly the sort of balance between the 3 key elements that I'd expect, and supporting packages are reasonably sized as well. The pairing of an exceptionally low-curved deck with the grind factor of Luris and a consistent sack outlet in the command zone feels like the recipe for a nicely fluid deck. This also seems like an impressively efficient deck considering the deck's fairly low budget, with just a handful of key pricey cards. So in broad strokes, I like how this deck is looking. In terms of how it could be improved, I have minor nitpicks such as disliking a couple colorless producing lands, but otherwise I don't have too much to say in terms of obvious things to change. I am a bit curious in terms of how the deck plays later in the game, though. It runs a moderate count of 7 cards for purposes of draining opponents, as well as a handful of cards for beating down opponents, but there's not much protection, so it seems like rapid wins aren't necessarily going to be guaranteed if an opponent is able to keep some of these in check, especially if they have exile-based removal. Likewise, this deck has a moderate removal suite, with 3 board wipes, 5 pieces of non-creature single-target removal, and 4 permanents with removal attached. This isn't bad by any means, and something like a Bounty Agent plus Luris does make for a nice removal engine, but I'm not fully confident that this interaction suite can hold off opponents long term if the deck's proactive plans start to have problems. Neither this nor the deck's win cons are an issue in isolation, but put together, this deck's endgame turns are definitely an area I'd want to keep an eye on, personally. Something like Benevolent Bodyguard might be an interesting thing to try, as a way to let the deck keep its key pieces protected, as well as offering another source of evasion. Next up, let's talk about Jolene's deck, In the Darkness Bind Them. This is a Grixis Reanimator deck with Sauron, Lord of the Rings, in the command zone. Sauron is an 8-mana creature that's both a graveyard enabler and a graveyard payoff, and above all else, this card feels like a gesture at what the deck is doing. It's playing 8-mana creatures, graveyard enablers, and graveyard payoffs. There are 18 graveyard enablers, containing a mixture of looting and mill, and also Perforos if you consider sneak attack effects to be graveyard enablers. There are also 15 graveyard payoffs, with about half of these being single-target reanimation cards, and the other half being a mixture of different other graveyard-enabled effects, including 2 living death effects. In terms of creatures to be reanimated, there are 15 creatures costing 6 or more mana, with these spanning a mixture of damage amplifiers, removal engines, and sources of draw. To support these, the deck contains a moderate ramp package and a somewhat modest interaction suite. So to start with, the reanimation part of this deck seems quite solid to me. You've got a good blend of different ways to fill the graveyard, and a solid suite of different ways to reanimate creatures. The creatures themselves are well picked. You've got cards to compound on the graveyard theme, as well as a number of classic tempo bombs that can help pull the game in your favor when they're dropped early. There are also some especially fun card choices mixed in here. The Perforos I mentioned earlier is a fun way to get value out of creatures before depositing them into the graveyard to await reanimation, and Backdraft Hellkite is a neat card that allows for the reusing of reanimation spells. So the core here I like, But the support cards around the edges start to get a bit weirder. There are 11 ramp spells here, 12 if you count Balrog as a ramp spell, and while this isn't a low number for a creature cheating deck in general, it is a bit low for casting the deck's 8 mana commander. Even if we set aside the commander as more of a mascot than a thing that needs to be achieved quickly, there's still a lot of high-costed stuff here that likely wouldn't mind a bit more ramp. The same goes for lands to a lesser extent. 36 lands plus a couple land cyclers isn't necessarily a low amount, and there are a handful of low-costed filtering cards that can help dig for lands, but a couple MDFCs to smooth things out likely wouldn't be unwelcome for guaranteeing this deck hits its land drops. Outside of this, I also wouldn't mind seeing a bit more protection and ways to interact with opponents. This deck has a bit of that, but it's mostly quite high cost and potentially a bit clunky to access when it's needed. Next, we can talk about Bree's deck, Galanra and Elena's Kaiju Cannon. This is a pretty unconventional combo deck that involves curving a 1-drop mana dork into Galanra, into Elena, into a 6-drop with a lot of power, and then tapping Elena to add a bunch of red mana. That red mana is then used to dig through the deck, drawing cards equal to the power of a creature on board if possible, using green mana from Manamorphose or another source. This draw is in service of finding an artifact that allows for paying mana to untap Elena, and which thereby generates infinite mana, hopefully giving the deck the resources it needs to find a way to close out the game. All of this kind of necessitates a deck with basically no cards out of place. This deck features 43 lands, 19 turn 1 dorks, 9 cards that draw cards equal to a creature's power, 7 tutors, 7 pseudo wheels, a handful of creatures here for their high power, a couple untapper artifacts, a few mana fixing cards, and just a handful of other cards. There is one card here for protection and a couple cards that could be used to remove something theoretically, but not a whole lot overall. This seems to be a basically purely proactive deck. It's steamrolling ahead with a daring game plan and hoping to outrace its opponents. So, this is quite a deck. I love the ingenuity and originality here. According to EDHREC, there is a grand total of 2 Elena Galanra decks that contain both Realm Seekers and Greater Good, which is wild. I also have to respect a deck that goes for a very specific game plan and tries to execute it as fast as possible, and this deck is obviously full effort chasing its specific game plan. With that said, this deck obviously has a challenging task on its hands if it wants to perform well against other high-power casual decks, purely because of the number of different components involved in its game plan. I pointed out that this deck is mostly lacking in interaction of any kind, and this kind of makes sense given the tightness of its list. Lacking interaction for opposing threats isn't ideal, but it also isn't the end of the world. This is a fiercely proactive deck, and if all goes ideally, you should be attempting a win before opponents have the chance to do anything too spooky. Hopefully. I wouldn't mind seeing a bit more protection, though. Deflecting SWAT is free, making it an easy choice, and from there I'd prioritize protection spells that can be cast for a single red, such as Bolt Bend and Pyroblast. Elena seems like the most vulnerable piece for this deck's game plan, and green mana will likely be the constraining factor on this deck's most pivotal turns, so focusing on things that can be cast with a single red mana will likely give the best shot of being able to afford protection at the most important moments. The final deck I'll be reviewing is Antoine's mono-black Doomsday deck. This is a Gonti Lord of Luxury theft deck based around the card Doomsday Excruciator, a demon printed in Duskmourn that removes all but the bottom 6 cards of each player's library. The synergy here is natural. Since Gonti steals a card from the top 4 of an opponent's library on ETB, they get to exert a degree of control of the bottom of libraries, as well as giving an additional available card once the deck is in Doomsday mode and can't afford to cast a draw spell. If Gonti is cast after the Excruciator trigger, they can also help get rid of opposing libraries more quickly. Also supporting the Doomsday Excruciator game plan are a couple cards that help buy time, and also a handful of cards that mill or exile cards from opposing libraries. In addition to stuff that helps the deck win, there are also a number of cards that are here seemingly to help Gonti get more triggers, which makes sense for purposes of generating value and ordering opposing bottom of libraries. This includes things like Panharmonicon, but also decidedly more black methods, such as sacrificing and recurring. Supporting the rest of this game plan, we have a decently robust ramp suite, a solid removal suite, some draw, and a handful of tutors for purposes of finding Mr. Excruciator. Overall, I love this deck's game plan. Doomsday Excruciator is a hilarious card, and using it alongside Gonti is fun, but not in a way that feels wildly unfair. This deck's game plan seems well calibrated to be flexible, with a lot of cards doing double duty as ways to mill out opponents in the endgame stages of things. There aren't really any especially powerful ways to win the game outside of Doomsday Excruciator and Grey Merchant of Asphodel, but honestly, this seems fine. Gonti is nice because the card is just very versatile in general. Casting Gonti multiple times poses a threat to opponents all on its own, because you're gradually picking away useful cards from their deck and developing your own suite of cards you can cast to try to give you an edge. Gonti also smooths over the question of removal to an extent, since you can always focus on stockpiling the best interaction you find with your Gonti triggers. So overall, this deck seems well built, and has a fun game plan for sure. I don't have any strong issues with this deck, but something that could be cool is trying a larger count of supernatural stamina style cards that can recur a creature when it dies. With the amount of ETB and sacrifice in this deck, I could see adding more of that, allowing the deck to get more value out of its creatures without needing to input too much additional mana. Hey folks, the first deck I'll be discussing is Good Facts deck, Phoenix, God of Lanterns. This is, as it sounds, a riff on lantern control with Phoenix in the command zone. I actually like this idea a lot, structurally speaking. Lantern Control is traditionally a deck in 60-card formats that involves revealing the top cards of players' libraries and then using cards like Codex Shredder to get rid of the most valuable draws for opponents. A struggle in converting this to Commander is that managing 3 opposing libraries rather than 1 is often much more difficult, since cards like Codex Shredder only mill 1 card, and cards like Ghoulcaller's Bell aren't selective about which opponents get their card milled. Phoenix is a nice solution to this, since he effectively turns all of a player's creatures into Codex Shredders, giving ample access to selective mill. Phoenix also has the benefit of offering a win con by boosting the volume of incremental mill, which is helpful since win cons are another area that Lantern control decks might struggle with in EDH. Naturally, this deck includes 3 Lantern effects, including Lantern itself, cards that keep the top card of players' libraries revealed. This deck also includes another classic Lantern control card, Ensnaring Bridge, which prevents creatures larger than the number of cards in its controller's hand from attacking them. Due to the importance of these key cards, this deck runs a whole lot of tutors to find them, which range from unconditional tutors to artifact tutors to the ever-fascinating Disciple of Deceit. Outside of these, the deck runs a handful of other cards that pair well with Phoenix for purposes of winning the game, particularly Eater of the Dead and Zelix. In terms of interaction, this deck is running decent quantities of removal and counter spells, and a whole bunch of stacks, including a fair amount of hate against draw and library searching. Overall, I appreciate the ingenuity of this deck, and it's always fun to see somebody attempt the task of building Lantern Control, a tricky archetype in the best of times. There's also a lot of fun card choices here, including several strange stacks pieces, some creatures with effects when they tap or untap, and some funky mill deck choices. Still, I can't help but get the sense that this deck might be cooking a bit too close to the sun. Though this deck does manage to solve some of the issues of translating Lantern Control to a multiplayer format, and it seems decently likely to achieve some sort of draw lock, in other ways the deck seems like it might have a bit of a challenging time. The only meaningfully fast win con I can identify here is untapping with an Eater of the Dead, which, as combos go, is quite interactable, and though the suite of stacks here is decently high quality, I'm not sure how quickly it's likely to get up and going. Too slowly, and you might be scrambling to get a defensive piece in play to hold off a wall of aggression, and then you're one piece of artifact removal away from eating a massive swing. I don't have perfect solutions on how to fix these issues, but personally, if I was trying to build a Phoenix Lantern control deck, I might go for more of a hybrid approach. More creatures, more untap synergies, and a stronger focus on pairing mill with a soft lock rather than rushing for a hard lock. Kudos on shooting for a more traditional approach, though, as that's a daunting task for sure, and it's cool to see it attempted. The next deck I'll be discussing is Mason's Budget Caradora deck. This is a vehicles and mounts deck with Caradora in the command zone, a card that tutors for a card with one of these types, and amplifies +1/+1 counters being added to creatures. The first thing I note here is the sheer densities of these card types. There are 23 vehicles, 11 mounts, and 12 non-land cards that mention vehicles or mounts in some way. These span a wide range of functions, from pure beaters to cards that also ramp or draw to removal. A couple other sub-themes also work alongside the commander. There are 8 cards that utilize +1/+1 counters, 6 cards that flicker creatures, and 7 creatures or vehicles with enter the battlefield effects in addition to Caradora. There's also a decent quantity of interaction, with 14 total cards, many of them vehicles. This deck's overall plan seems to be getting out Caradora, grabbing some value vehicles or mounts to build advantage, and then overwhelming opponents with a mass of these card types. So this is an interesting riff on Caradora. Mounts and vehicles are both pretty fun card types, and this deck goes all in on both. This is an interesting choice for a Caradora deck, given that she doesn't actually reward having a critical mass of these card types, and neither do any other cards in the deck save for 2. Now, a lot of this isn't really a problem. I respect the gumption of playing a whole lot of mounts, and it's a great card type. That said, the quantity of vehicles here does seem a bit excessive. A challenging part of the vehicle subtype is that they don't really get to exist on the board without creatures. If you can't animate them, you can't really use them. This is often overcome by them being especially high-statted or having cool effects, but only up to a point. In this case, 23 is just too many vehicles. You're going to have lots of games where you draw more vehicles than creatures, and that's a recipe to have a pretty sluggish rollout, where it takes extra time in order to turn your board into a board. Personally, I'd go a bit further into the +1/+1 counter sub-theme. There are a lot of great budget creatures like Lagorin, Champion of Lamholt, Tireless Tracker, Skooz, and Catilda, and Caradora's second ability is basically free real estate for any of these. Next up, let's get to Sebastian's deck, Abridged. This is a deck that uses the backside of Asika, Prismatic Bridge, which is a legendary enchantment that seeks a creature or planeswalker and puts it into play on each of its owner's upkeeps. Can we just use the word seek in Paper Magic? I don't want to say the long version. Anyway, this deck contains a single creature, Progenitus, a 10-mana 10/10 with protection for everything, that shuffles itself into its owner's library when it dies. So, simple basic game plan. Play Prismatic Bridge, get a Progenitus, do things with said Progenitus. But what sorts of things? Well, for one, dealing damage to opponents. This deck runs 2 haste enablers and several other cards that double or triple Progenitus' combat damage in some way or other. The other thing this deck does with Progenitus is draw cards. There are 7 cards here that draw cards equal to a creature's mana value or power, sometimes sacrificing it in the process. Outside of these cards, this deck also naturally runs a good amount of ramp to make sure it can hit Prismatic Bridge on turn 4, as well as 2 counterspells, 6 defensive cards, and 10 sources of removal to stay alive and keep opponents in check. So the overall plan here is to get our Prismatic Progenitus engine chugging before pulling ahead in card advantage, dismantling opposing threats, and knocking down players for the win. As a side plan, there's also a Maze's End plus Gates package tucked into the land base, as an alternate win plan for if the Progenitus protocol is encountering challenges. Overall, this deck has a strong sense of elegance to it. There's a very straightforward plan to get Progenitus on the field, and then plenty of things to be done with the Progenitus once it's out. The fact that some of these things sacrifice the Hydra avatar initially struck me as a bit odd, since I was thinking about this as a sort of Voltron deck, but on further consideration, it makes all the sense in the world. Anything that sacrifices Progenitus just allows the Prismatic Bridge to pop it back out again on the following turn, forming a strange sort of engine. The idea to combine this with Maze's End is pretty smart, since the deck can't actually contain any other creatures or planeswalkers, which limits card type options for alternate win cons. One potential problem that could exist in the deck comes down to its linearity. It's quite straightforward and predictable, meaning that it's naturally going to struggle if opponents prepare for it and hunt for the right sorts of answers in advance. One of these would be non-targeted exile-based removal for Progenitus, something like Farewell or Settle the Wreckage, which could put it out of commission permanently. One option to combat this could be adding more ways of sacrificing Progenitus, such as some of the flares from MH3. This could be paired with other options for smoothing out the game plan, such as adding more sources of haste to get Progenitus back and swinging quicker, as well as adding something like Sterling Grove to prevent the Prismatic Bridge from getting bullied off the board too much. The only other thing that might be worth doing is swapping out some of the non-green gates for more untapped lands. Maze's End necessitates some number of gates, but 19 seems more than necessary, and cutting some could help the deck have untapped mana more often. Next, I'll be discussing Jonathan's deck, I Can Do This All Day. This is a Sunforger Toolbox deck with Captain America in the command zone. Cap is a 3-mana 4/4 that attaches an equipment to itself each combat, and which can pay 3 mana and unequip something to deal damage equal to that card's mana value split among up to 3 targets. This is paired here with Sunforger, an equipment that can be unequipped to cast a red or white instant with mana value 4 or less. So immediately here, we have a decent engine that can churn out various answers, and the first step in assembling this engine is grabbing Sunforger. There are 10 different tutors that can find or chain to find Sunforger, with the specifics spanning a variety of different cards. The other thing this deck naturally has is red and white instants, and these can broadly be separated into a handful of different categories. 8 are board protection, 6 are defensive cards, 2 are general purpose removal, and 1 is a counterspell. As the other piece of support for this game plan, there's also 6 cards that help in cheating equip costs, allowing for a greater rate of sunforging and using Cap's ability. The final part of this deck is the winning plan. This deck features a deep suite of other equipments, which span a range of different buffing and utility purposes, and which include Excalibur as a haymaker finisher that can be repeatedly equipped and unequipped to barrage opposing boards and life totals for dozens of damage. Overall, this deck looks like a lot of fun. There are lots of flashy cards here, and it's dipping into a lot of different gameplay options, as toolbox decks have the natural ability to do. The tutoring suite is quite robust, which could be awkward if the deck was low on equipments other than Sunforger, but it seems like equipments are a pretty major card type for the deck, so things work out decently well. The deck also has the right balances of supporting cards, a healthy ramping suite to help the deck get on its feet and pay equip costs, and a more modest draw suite to bolster the already value-crunching core of the deck. In terms of ways to win the game, I'd be curious to see how quickly it can happen outside of Excalibur, but broadly, there should be enough here to get the deck to the finish line in most games. Where I'm a bit more skeptical is in this deck's choices for Sunforger targets. There's a ton of protection and defensive cards here, and while this isn't necessarily a bad thing in principle, it's a choice I'm skeptical of in a Sunforger deck. The card offers easy access to a whole library worth of instants, and once you go above 3 of a certain card type, that kind of stops being a Sunforger choice and starts being something you'll be actively drawing pretty often. With that in mind, I expect the protective cards could start to clog up hands in games where artifact ward wipes aren't being thrown out a lot, and that defensive cards could do the same if opponents aren't playing beatdown decks. You could switch out some of these for more general purpose cards. Swapping protection spells for additional red-blue counterspells and defensive cards for more general purpose removal could smooth out the deck's matchup variance and give more tools against combo-oriented decks. The last deck I'll be discussing is Trevor Betrayer of Keldor's deck, Greasefang Rides Again. This is a Greasefang deck, and I want to call it a vehicles deck, but it's almost closer to a sort of hybrid control deck compared to most Greasefang decks I've seen. The rat himself is a 3-mana 4/3 that reanimates a vehicle at the beginning of combat with haste, and bounces it back to hand at end of turn. Naturally, this deck contains 12 vehicles, which is less than you might expect for this, but it also does contain 6 cards that can tutor things to the graveyard. There are also 9 cards that discard things from hand, allowing the deck to get vehicles back in the graveyard for more usage, and a couple cards also serve as flicker engines to keep reanimated vehicles on the board permanently. I call this a control deck because there's a truly impressive amount of interaction present of a variety of types. Single target, board wipes, defensive cards, stacks, 26 pieces in total among all types. 4 of these are rule of law effects, seemingly here to slow down the pace of the game, and I can see the idea here alongside what's effectively a value engine sort of commander. This deck's overall game plan seems to be gradually building up value and dealing damage, while keeping opponents heavily in check through a diverse suite of interaction. Overall, I like this somewhat unique take on Greasefang. Turning the deck into basically a controlling reanimator deck seems like a fun playstyle. The vehicles present are mostly big enough to present a solid threat, each on their own, and the amount of discard present seems nice for keeping a key vehicle in a continual cycle of hand to graveyard to board to hand. The 2 flicker cards are icing on the cake, letting the deck gradually build up its board of vehicles over time and likely constituting a pretty solid win con. I also love the diversity of interaction present here. The stacks is a good anchor for the playstyle, but this deck seems like it'll also have answers for just about anything, and a couple sweet defensive cards as well. One thing that does stick out to me a little here is the land base of this deck. It's a bit thin in general, and has a handful of suspect choices. There are 30 dedicated lands and 5 MDFCs present here, which isn't an awfully low number, but it's also not very high either given this deck's play patterns. There isn't a wildly large amount of ramp to boost this deck up to higher mana values, and there also isn't a wealth of easy-to-access draw effects to find more lands, with much of this deck's draw requiring sacrificing artifacts. Adding 2 to 3 more lands seems like it could improve this deck's odds of having keepable hands and avoiding missed land drops on turns 4 to 6, and these could even come in the form of lands that replace themselves, such as Silent Clearing or Monumental Henge. I'd also replace a handful of the ones that are already here. Shine Shadow Snarl and Tainted Field both seem a bit weak given the deck's low basic count, and I also personally wouldn't run Spire of Industry in a 2-color deck unless it had a whole lot of low-cost artifacts, which this deck doesn't really have. Also, I don't know what your experience has been with Ancient Den and Vault of Whispers, but I found myself getting burned by non-indestructible artifact lands often enough that I wouldn't run them in a deck that isn't loaded with artifact synergies, and this deck decidedly isn't that, particularly if you end up cutting Spire of Industry. Alrighty folks, that's all for the reviews.